The night was cold on the ruined planet of Verith 4. Once a home to millions, it was now a wasteland of fallen buildings, scorched ground, and the whispers of a war that had left nothing but sorrow behind. In the dark corners of a collapsed structure, Kavani hid, her body curled protectively around her small child. Luri, her heart pounded against her chest, and her sharp ears twitched at every sound. The war had taken everything from her husband, her home, and now her safety. But nothing mattered more than keeping Luri alive. And that was why she trembled in fear when she saw the human. Across the broken ruins, not far from where she hid, a lone human soldier limped forward. His uniform was torn, his face covered in dirt and dried blood. His right leg dragged slightly, showing an injury. He looked exhausted, barely able to keep walking. Kavani's breath caught in her throat. A human. Here. So close. The Zereth people had spoken of humans, monsters, they called them. Savage, ruthless, and worst of all, carnivorous. They ate flesh, their own or their enemies, with no mercy. The thought of one being near her child made Kavani's body tense in terror. She pulled Luri closer, whispering in his ear, "Don't make a sound, little one. The monster will hear." Luri, though young, understood. He clutched his mother's arm tightly, burying his face in her chest. The human, unaware of their presence, stumbled forward. He looked around, scanning the ruins as if searching for something. Shelter, maybe. Food? Then, without warning, he collapsed. Kavani's breath hitched. Was he dead? Or was this a trick? She remained perfectly still, watching. The human didn't move. His body lay still, his chest rising and falling faintly. His injuries were worse than she had thought. Luri shifted slightly in her arms, his curiosity stronger than his fear. "Mama," he whispered, "is the human sleeping?" Kavani pressed a hand over his mouth, eyes darting back to the human. But it was too late. Luri's voice, though soft, echoed slightly in the quiet ruins. The human stirred. Kavani's heart raced as the human groaned, lifting his head weakly. His gaze turned in their direction. She pressed herself against the wall, every instinct screaming at her to run. But it was too late. He had heard them. For a long moment, there was silence. The human didn't move any closer. He simply looked at the darkness where they hid, his face unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he raised his hands slightly, palms open. A universal sign of peace. Kavani didn't trust it. She tightened her grip on Luri. Then, slowly, the human reached into his belt. Kavani tensed, ready to flee, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small silver box. He pressed a button, and the box opened. Inside was something Kavani didn't expect, a medical kit. The human was offering help. Kavani's mind spun. Why? No human would help a Zereth, especially not after the war. Was it a trick? A way to lure her out? She hesitated, but then she felt Luri's small leg tremble against her. She looked down. In the darkness, she hadn't noticed. Luri's leg was bleeding. It must have happened during their escape earlier that day. She had been so focused on hiding that she hadn't even realized her child was injured. And now, a human, a supposed enemy, was offering help. Her breath came fast and shallow. Trust a human. Impossible. But what choice did she have? The human set the medical kit down between them and slowly backed away. He sat against a fallen wall, still watching but making no further moves. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't forcing her to come closer. He was waiting. Kavani hesitated. Every instinct told her not to trust him. But then she looked at Luri, whose small face was pale, his injury needing attention. She made a decision. With cautious steps, she reached out, grabbed the medical kit, and retreated back into the shadows. The human did not move. For the first time, Kavani felt something she never thought she would associate with a human. Doubt. Was he really the monster she had always feared? She didn't know yet, But something inside her told her this night would change everything. Kavani sat in the shadows, staring at the small human medical kit in her hands. Her heart still pounded in her chest. Every instinct told her to run, hide, and never trust a human. But her child, Luri, was injured. She glanced at the human. He was still sitting against the broken wall, breathing heavily. His face was pale, his injury serious. But he wasn't moving toward her. He wasn't attacking. Kavani bit her lip. Could she really use a human's medicine? What if it was poisoned? What if it made Luri sick? Luri let out a small whimper, his little hand gripping her arm. He was in pain. Kavani closed her eyes for a moment, then made her decision. She had no choice. She opened the medical kit carefully. Inside, she found a small scanning device and some bandages. She had seen something similar before. Advanced healing technology that the humans used during the war. If this worked, it could stop Luri's wound from getting worse. With trembling hands, she pressed the scanner to Luri's leg. A soft blue light spread over his wound, and within seconds, the bleeding slowed. The device sealed the cut with a thin protective layer. Kavani let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. It worked. Luri blinked up at her, then at the human. Mama, the human helped. Kavani didn't know how to answer. She looked at the soldier again. His head had tilted forward slightly, his eyes fluttering shut. He was weak. Luri shifted in her arms. He's hurt too. Kavani tensed. Yes, he was. His leg was wounded, and there were deep scratches along his arm. Blood stained his torn uniform. And yet, he had chosen to help her child first. The stories about humans painted them as monsters. But monsters didn't offer help. Monsters didn't sit quietly and wait. Kavani clenched her fists. What was she supposed to do? For a long moment, she remained frozen. But then Luri pulled away from her grip, and before she could stop him, crawled toward the human. Luri, she hissed, reaching for him. But the child stopped just in front of the soldier and, with wide, innocent eyes, placed a small hand on the human's arm. Kavani's breath caught. The soldier's eyes slowly opened. He looked down at Luri, surprise flickering across his face. He didn't move. He didn't push the child away. Instead, he gave a small, weak smile. Luri tilted his head. "Are you okay?" he asked in a soft voice. The human exhaled, then said something in his language. Kavani didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was gentle. Then, with slow, careful movements, the human lifted his hands. Again, a sign of peace. Kavani's body remained tense, her muscles ready to grab Luri and run. But the human did nothing threatening. He just let Luri examine him, as if he understood that the child was not afraid of him the way Kavani was. Then Kavani noticed something. The human was shivering. She frowned. His wounds, the cold air, his exhaustion. He wouldn't survive the night like this. The war had taken many lives. She had seen what humans could do when they were at full strength. But this one, he was just a man, broken and alone, just like she was. She clenched her fists. Was she really going to help a human? Her eyes fell on Luri, who was now touching the human's fingers with curiosity. The soldier didn't pull away. If anything, he looked, grateful for the small connection. Kavani sighed. Slowly, hesitantly, she crawled forward and placed the medical scanner near the human's injured leg. The human stiffened but didn't resist. He just watched her. The blue light spread over his wound, sealing it like it had done for Luri. When it was done, the human let out a slow breath, closing his eyes in relief. Kavani backed away quickly, still uncertain. But the human nodded at her, his expression soft. "Thank you," he murmured. She didn't know his words, but she understood his tone. For the first time in her life, Kavani realized something that shook her very soul. Maybe, just maybe, humans weren't the monsters she had always feared. The cave was silent except for the faint sounds of breathing. Cavani sat near the entrance, keeping watch. Outside, the alien jungle was dark, filled with strange noises, distant roars, rustling leaves, and the occasional chirping of night creatures. She should have left by now. After treating the human's wound, she had planned to take Lurie and disappear before he regained too much strength. But something kept her here. She glanced toward the human. He was asleep now, his chest rising and falling steadily. The bandages she had used from his own medical kit had stopped the bleeding. His body was still weak, but he wasn't dying anymore. Lurie had curled up near him, resting his small head against Cavani's side. The child trusted the human now. Cavani didn't know how to feel about that. The stories had always been clear. Humans were dangerous. They were killers, conquerors, flesh-eaters. That's what the elders used to say. And yet this one had protected them. He had given his medical supplies to Lurie first, even when he was in pain himself. Why? What did he want? Her grip on her staff tightened. She needed to be careful. Suddenly, the human stirred. Cavani tensed as he opened his eyes, blinking slowly. He looked around for a moment, then his gaze fell on her. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, with great effort, the human pushed himself up into a sitting position. He winced but didn't complain. Cavani expected him to say something in his language, but instead, he gestured. First, he pointed to himself. Ethan. Cavani frowned. What was he doing? The human repeated the gesture. Ethan, he said again, tapping his chest. Lurie, still half asleep, mimicked the movement. Ethan, he repeated curiously. The human, Ethan, smiled and nodded. Cavani exhaled sharply. Was he telling them his name? Ethan then pointed at her, tilting his head. He was asking for her name. Cavani hesitated. She shouldn't give him anything. But Lurie was watching. The child's innocent eyes were full of trust. Finally, she sighed. Cavani. Ethan nodded slowly, as if memorizing it. Then, with effort, he pointed to Lurie. Lurie grinned and patted his own chest. Lurie. Ethan chuckled softly. His voice was weak, but the sound was warm. Cavani didn't know how to feel about that. She watched as Ethan slowly reached for something in his pack. Cavani's muscles tensed, ready to attack if needed. But when he pulled his hand out, it wasn't a weapon. It was a small silver packet. Food. Ethan carefully tore it open and pulled out a small protein bar. He took a tiny bite first, showing it wasn't poison. Then he broke off a piece and held it out toward Lurie. Cavani's heart pounded. She should stop him. But Lurie, with his endless curiosity, reached out and took it before she could react. He sniffed the food carefully, then took a bite. Cavani watched closely, ready to pull him away. But nothing happened. Lurie chewed thoughtfully, then smiled. It's good, he said, taking another bite. Ethan chuckled again and leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He looked exhausted. Cavani's eyes flickered between the two. Something about this wasn't right. Why was Ethan doing this? Why was he being kind? Before she could think further, a distant howl echoed through the jungle. Cavani stiffened. She knew that sound. Predators. Lurie's ears twitched, and even Ethan looked toward the entrance. He didn't know what it was, but he could tell it was bad. Cavani stood up immediately. She couldn't stay here. The scent of blood would attract more creatures. She grabbed her small pack and looked at Lurie. We need to move. Lurie looked at her, then at Ethan. What about him? Cavani clenched her jaw. She should leave him. He was still weak, and humans were dangerous. But Lurie's eyes were pleading. And Ethan. Ethan had saved them. She let out a long breath, then turned to Ethan. She pointed at him, then toward the jungle, hoping he would understand. They had to leave. Ethan studied her, then nodded. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. Cavani was surprised. He was clearly struggling, but he wasn't asking for help. For the first time, she saw something in him that was familiar. Not a monster, a survivor, just like her. Cavani exhaled sharply. This was a mistake. But she still held out her hand. Ethan hesitated, then took it. Together, they left the cave behind. The night was dark, and danger surrounded them. But for the first time, Cavani wasn't just protecting Lurie. She was protecting a human too. The jungle was alive with danger. Cavani moved quickly, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow. Lurie clung to her back, his small arms wrapped around her shoulders. Behind them, Ethan stumbled forward, his steps uneven but determined. The distant howls grew louder. The predators were coming. Cavani had lived on this planet long enough to know what that meant. They had to keep moving. She glanced back at Ethan. He was struggling. His injuries slowed him down, and every step looked painful. Leaving him behind would be easier. But Lurie wouldn't allow it. The child had already bonded with the human, and something deep inside Cavani told her that Ethan wasn't like the others. She sighed, then stepped closer to him. Without a word, she grabbed his arm and pulled it over her shoulder, supporting his weight. Ethan tensed for a moment, but then nodded in understanding. Together, they moved. They walked for hours, deeper into the jungle. The thick trees blocked most of the moonlight, but Cavani knew where she was going. Lurie had fallen asleep on her back, his breathing soft. Ethan was exhausted too, but he never complained. He just kept going. Finally, Cavani stopped near a small hidden clearing. It was safe here, at least for a while. She gently set Lurie down on the soft grass. Ethan collapsed beside a tree, breathing heavily. His face was pale, and his wound was still fresh. He needed more rest. Cavani hesitated, then knelt beside him. She pulled out a small pouch from her belt, opening it to reveal a handful of crushed herbs. Ethan watched as she carefully pressed the herbs onto his wound. A sharp smell filled the air. "Help stop infection," she muttered, not expecting him to understand. To her surprise, Ethan nodded. "Thank you," he said weakly. Cavani didn't reply. She didn't know what to say. She had spent her whole life fearing humans. Now, she was saving one. As the night stretched on, Cavani kept watch. Ethan had fallen asleep, and Lurie was curled up beside him. She stared at them in silence. For so long, she had believed that humans were monsters. But Ethan, he had risked his life for them. He had protected Lurie, even when he was injured. She had always been told that humans were selfish, that they only cared about their own kind. Was that a lie? A soft breeze moved through the trees. Cavani tightened her grip on her staff. She didn't have all the answers yet. But one thing was clear. She couldn't leave Ethan behind. Not anymore. Cavani sat near the fire, sharpening the tip of her spear. The flames flickered in the dark jungle, casting shadows on the trees. The night was quiet, but she knew better than to relax. This planet was never truly safe. Across from her, Ethan stirred. His face was still pale from the injury, but he looked better than before. Lurie was curled up beside him, sleeping peacefully. Cavani's sharp eyes studied the human. He was different. He had no weapons, no armor, just a stubborn will to survive. And yet, despite everything, he had protected them. Ethan slowly sat up, groaning as he touched his wound. Cavani tossed him a small pouch. "Chew the leaves inside," she said. "It will help with pain." Ethan took the pouch and looked inside. The crushed leaves had a strange smell, but he trusted her. He placed a few in his mouth and winced. Cavani smirked slightly. "Bitter, but it works." Ethan nodded and chewed slowly. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound being the crackling fire. Then Ethan spoke. "Why do you fear humans so much?" Cavani's grip on her spear tightened. She had expected this question. She looked away, staring into the flames. "Because humans hunt us." Ethan frowned. "Not all humans." Cavani let out a small bitter laugh. That is what they all say. Ethan shook his head. I don't hurt innocent people. He looked at Lurie, sleeping peacefully. And I would never harm a child. Kavani studied him for a long moment. Was he telling the truth? She sighed. You are not like the others. Maybe. I was wrong about all humans. Ethan gave a small, tired smile. And maybe I was wrong about aliens. For the first time, Kavani felt something strange. Trust. Morning arrived with the soft chirping of jungle birds. The sunlight peeked through the leaves, warming the cold air. Kavani stood up and stretched. They had rested long enough. It was time to move. We need to find a safer place, she said. The predators will return. Ethan nodded, though he still looked weak. He wasn't fully healed, but he pushed himself to stand. Kavani glanced at him. He had strength. A different kind of strength than warriors, but strength nonetheless. She turned to Lurie, gently shaking the child awake. We must go. Lurie yawned and rubbed his eyes. Then he looked at Ethan and smiled. Ethan stays with us. Kavani hesitated for a second, then nodded. Yes, he stays. Lurie cheered and held Ethan's hand. The human seemed surprised but smiled. Kavani watched them. Something inside her had changed. Maybe this human was not the enemy she had always feared. But dangers still lurked in the jungle, and if they wanted to survive, they had to keep moving. The morning air was cool, and the jungle was still waking up. Kavani led the way, moving through the thick trees with silent steps. Lurie walked beside her, his small hand gripping the edge of her cloak. Ethan followed behind, still weak but determined to keep up. They had been walking for hours, searching for a safer place. The predators of the night were gone. But now, a new danger was approaching. Ethan suddenly stopped. His body tensed, and his eyes scanned the trees. Kavani noticed his change in posture immediately. What is it? She asked. Ethan didn't answer at first. He took a slow breath, listening carefully. Then he whispered, We're not alone. Kavani's grip tightened around her spear. She heard it too now, a faint rustling sound. Footsteps moving through the undergrowth. Her heart pounded. This wasn't an animal. This was something else. Then the smell hit her. Burned metal, oil, gunpowder. Her eyes widened. Humans. Kavani grabbed Lurie and pushed him behind her. Stay close. Do not make a sound. Ethan stepped forward, his face serious. Are you sure it's humans? Kavani gave him a sharp look. I know their scent. Ethan clenched his fists. This was bad. The rustling grew louder. Voices. Then, a deep voice echoed through the trees. Spread out. The alien widow and her child must be close. Find them. Lurie gasped softly, fear in his big eyes. He grabbed Ethan's hand, holding on tightly. Ethan felt anger rise inside him. They were hunting her. Hunting a mother and child. Kavani's jaw tightened. She knew these hunters. They worked for those who wanted her kind gone. If they found her, they would take Lurie and kill her. But this time, she wasn't alone. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. We won't let them take him, he whispered. Kavani looked at him, surprised. Then she nodded. Together, they would fight. The jungle was thick, but the hunters were skilled. Kavani could hear their footsteps getting closer. She turned to Ethan. Can you fight? Ethan smirked. I might not have a weapon, but I have a plan. Kavani raised an eyebrow. I am listening. Ethan crouched down, picking up a handful of small stones. We don't have to fight them head on. We just need to make them think we're somewhere else. Kavani's eyes narrowed. A distraction. Ethan nodded. He looked at Lurie. Stay with your mother, okay? I'll be right back. Lurie didn't want to let go, but Ethan gave him a reassuring smile. Then he moved. Kavani watched as Ethan disappeared into the trees, moving quietly. For a human, he was clever. Minutes later, a loud noise echoed through the jungle. Rocks clattered, and branches snapped. The hunters reacted immediately. There, to the left. Several of them rushed toward the noise, their weapons ready. Kavani saw her chance. Now, she whispered to Lurie. She grabbed him and ran in the opposite direction. Ethan's distraction had worked. They moved fast, weaving through the trees. Kavani could hear the hunters shouting behind them. Confused, Ethan reappeared from the bushes, running beside them. Kavani gave him a nod. That was reckless, but effective. Ethan grinned. I'm full of surprises. But the danger wasn't over yet. A gunshot rang out. Bang! Kavani's heart stopped. They had been seen. A bullet hit the tree next to her, splintering wood. The hunters had found them. Ethan grabbed Lurie and pulled him down. We need to move faster. Kavani's mind raced. They couldn't outrun bullets. They needed cover. Then she saw it, an old cave entrance hidden between the rocks. This way, she shouted. Ethan didn't hesitate. He carried Lurie and ran. Kavani followed, spears clutched tightly in her hands. They reached the cave just as another shot rang out. They dived inside, safe for now. Kavani pressed her back against the wall, breathing heavily. Lurie clung to Ethan, shaking. Outside, the hunters searched. They weren't safe yet. Ethan looked at Kavani. What now? She took a deep breath, her golden eyes glowing in the dim light. Now, we fight. The cave was dark and damp, but it provided cover. Kavani, Ethan, and little Lurie crouched near the back, listening to the hunters outside. Their voices were sharp, filled with frustration. They ran into the cave. One of them shouted. Another growled. Then we corner them. They won't escape. Ethan clenched his fists. They had only minutes before the hunters came in. Kavani's grip on her spear tightened. She knew there was no running now. Lurie whimpered, pressing his small hands against his mother's arm. Mama, I'm scared. Kavani knelt and touched his forehead gently. You are strong, my child. Do not fear. Ethan looked at the boy and then at Kavani. His expression hardened. He wasn't going to let them take her child. The first hunter stepped inside. He held a rifle, his boots crunching against the dirt floor. His eyes scanned the darkness. Kavani didn't hesitate. She moved like lightning. Before the hunter could react, her spear struck, knocking his weapon aside. With a swift motion, she spun and kicked him back. The man crashed into the wall, groaning. Get in there. Another hunter shouted from outside. More footsteps. More danger. Ethan grabbed a rock from the ground. It wasn't a weapon, but it was something. He turned to Kavani. You take the front. I'll protect the kid. She hesitated, just for a second, then nodded. They were in this together. The second hunter rushed in. Kavani met him head-on. She was faster, stronger. He swung a knife at her, but she ducked and countered with a powerful strike to his chest. The air left his lungs as he stumbled back. Ethan saw movement from the corner of his eye. A third hunter. This one aimed a gun at Kavani's back. Ethan didn't think. He just acted. He threw the rock as hard as he could. It hit the hunter's wrist. The shot fired, but it missed. Kavani spun around, eyes fierce. She leaped and tackled the man to the ground. The fight was brutal. The hunters were strong, but Kavani and Ethan were stronger. One by one, the attackers fell, groaning in pain. Finally, only silence remained. Ethan took a deep breath. His body ached, but they had won. Kavani stood over the unconscious hunters, chest rising and falling. Her golden eyes glowed softly in the darkness. Lurie ran to her, hugging her tightly. Mama. She knelt and held him close. She had almost lost him, but Ethan had helped. She looked at the human, studying him. He had risked everything to protect them. Ethan leaned against the cave wall, exhausted but smiling. Not bad for a carnivorous human, huh? Kavani's lips curled into the smallest smile. She had misjudged him. Not all humans were monsters. Some were protectors. As dawn broke, they left the cave. The jungle was quiet again, the danger gone. Cavani walked beside Ethan, Luri holding both their hands. They weren't just strangers anymore. Luri looked up at Ethan. "Will you stay with us?" Ethan glanced at Cavani. She hesitated, then nodded. "You are one of us now." Ethan smiled. For the first time, in a long time, he had a family. And together, they stepped into a new future.